Okay, in this video I will be replacing the three-way valve for my pool. I cut the old one out last winter, or just before last winter, to winterize it because it was sort of hard connected and I couldn't remove it. And when I removed it, it turns out it was broken anyway. So you can see a piece of plastic flopping around in there. I don't think it is actually critical. However, I'm sure there was some water leakage when you tried to close one of the valves. So it sat in there like that. I had to remove it to pour some of the antifreeze down the lines, and now I've got this one. So it's all good. This cost about $45 Canadian. Kind of expensive. I probably could have got it cheaper, but whatever, I needed it. So here we go, and it's just going to drop in there like that. However, I am going to do some cutting here. And I'm also going to be adding some of these elbows, and you can see that these ones have quick disconnects so that next winter I don't have to cut things or try and rip them apart. I can just undo the screws and then winterize the pool that way. And they're going to just drop on the intake lines like that. And the one on the left is for the drain and the one on the right is for the skimmer. And I've got one additional one that's going to go to the pump. Now I do use this hose because I had it handy and sitting around. However, I go back and replace that hose. The hose is only really good for the send line, not good for the suction line. And I got some screwdrivers, some Teflon tape, stuff like that. And sort of the first thing we're going to do here is do some cutting. So I'm going to cut these things down. Ultimately, I'm going to do a much larger job and replace this entire pump shanty that I've got going on here. So I plan on cutting these down right to the dirt and then have a 90-degree T sticking up so that it's not on a big angle and sort of a little wonky, if you will. But for now, I'll just do a sort of a hasty replacement of things and get it up and running for the initial summer here. So like I said, just going to hack that down and remove it. And then I will put in some flexible lines here shortly. When you're putting these in, obviously you got to make sure you've got the screw cap on, and you also need your mechanical hose clamps. Everything just sort of shoves together. I'm not sure if this is the best way or if you should be gluing things into place, but I found that one mechanical hose clamp can be inadequate for the more rigid pipes, and that in fact you want to go with two hose clamps. For the rigid ones, if you're using the flexible hose, I found that you can get away with just the one hose clamp. Once I've got the one hose cut down to height, I'm just going to sort of eyeball it and cut the second hose down. And again, I've got a whole bunch of fittings. So this is a sort of a straight through fitting. I've got 90-degree elbows, stuff like that. Most of the fittings are pretty cheap, so it is beneficial if you have a whole bunch on hand. And that way you're not running back and forth to the pool supply store when you don't have the things that you need. For this short hose, I found that it was actually adequate and you didn't need a stronger hose on the suction side. Just because it's so short, it didn't actually collapse on itself. But when I went to a larger length of hose, it actually did sort of start collapsing on itself. So like I said, I usually use two hose clamps for everything. And definitely instead of using the flathead screwdriver, I'd recommend using a socket or a wrench to get those significantly tighter. For all the screw-in fittings, I definitely use a lot of the Teflon tape. If you don't use it, you're going to have leaks for sure. And in fact, even when you use it, if you just don't use enough of it, I find that you're going to have a whole lot of leaks. So I am pretty liberal in my application of Teflon tape. And then obviously it just screws together fairly simply. So there's the whole thing together. And I didn't show it, but I also put Teflon tape on the quick disconnect fittings. Now, like I said, I am going to sort of redo this whole thing, so I wasn't too concerned about getting it super straight. However, after I ran it for a little while, I did find that I was getting some air in the system, and I don't know if that was a function of the angle of the valve. I would think maybe not, but either way, once I sort of straightened out the pipe here, which I'll do relatively shortly, I found that it definitely functioned a little bit better than having it at a bit of a funky angle. So even though I didn't want to do a good job on this, I was just sort of doing a quick fix before I ripped the whole thing apart. I ended up doing a fairly detailed job here. And then for the pump, I got it this 90-degree angle, which I just had kicking around, and I'll throw that on the pump so I can actually get a straight line to the valve. There's pretty much the whole thing set up. Like I said, I do replace that length of hose. In fact, I replaced all that length of hose because I did find that they started to collapse a little bit once the pump was running. So I wouldn't use that string braided line. And just like all the other fittings that screw together, a liberal application of Teflon tape is highly recommended. And there's the last quick connect going on. And like I said, this will be much better in the fall when I want to go and winterize the lines. I'm not going to have to cut anything or try and rip things apart. It'll all come apart fairly easily, and I can bring the valve inside or leave it in my garage. So like I said, I did do a run up with the flexible hose on there, and the one going to the pump collapsed in. This smaller length, I mean, it's too short really to collapse in very much, but I went to the pool supply store and I got a more robust pipe that's actually suited for the suction side. So you can see the old one there is a little bit squishy. That one's fine because that's actually under pressure, so it's expanding out, not sucking in. But anywhere where there's going to be a negative pressure, it could end up collapsing that hose. So if you're trying to get these connections separated, it is beneficial to have something like a hairdryer, or in my case, I'm just using some fairly hot water, pouring that on or around the connection, and then after a few seconds, it should pop off. But if it's cold, those fittings can be difficult, if not impossible, to remove by hand, so heating them up definitely helps. So like I said, I was getting air bubbles in the system when the valve was at an angle, so I'm just going to raise the drain side up a little bit so that the valve is sitting level to the ground, and that definitely fixes the problem. So I definitely would recommend you have your valve level to the ground. And again, I used 2 hose clamps on every connection. And then I'll drop in a 90-degree elbow as well. And I'm just putting this 90-degree elbow in as a temporary test. You can see I put 90-degree elbows on both the skimmer and drain because I wanted to test each one, see what kind of pressure I was getting, make sure there was no air in the system. And what I found was that they both function perfectly once they're isolated by themselves, and that's kind of why I went with the leveling off of the valve. So I did my test, everything works good, and that convinced me that having a level valve would be a better call than having one that's on an angle. So still a little bit of a funky angle. Like I said, once I rip the shed apart, I'm going to put 90-degree angles at ground level and then bring them up from there, and then I'll get this thing perfectly level. I would say it's off by maybe a couple of degrees. It's close to level. Close enough. So now I'm pulling from both the skimmer and the drain at the same time. If I turn the valve, I've just turned off the drain, and now I'm pulling only from the skimmer. See, it's still working good. And the pressure, it sits a little bit lower if I'm just pulling out of ones. So 10 psi in the filter. If I switch it over to the main drain and turn the skimmer off, still see it's functioning. A little bit more pressure, maybe 11 psi. And then if I put it on to both at the same time, once again, you can see the pump is still functioning just fine, and the pressure goes up to, I don't know, 12 or 13 psi. So overall, pretty simple to add a 3-way valve. Definitely I would put it level, or as level as you can get it, and that'll help when you're trying to prime your system. And the other thing I actually used but didn't show on the video is that Hayward O-ring lubricant. So I put that on all the rubber O-rings as well, just to get better seals on things. Anyway, now the pool just needs to warm up. Thanks for checking out my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe.